So you could say, well, why were people more afraid of SARS than of the flu? I would say, well, because it was new. We weren't used to it. You know, the flu, sure, we've known there's flus. We know some people die, but most people don't, and we're sort of prepared for that. But SARS, well, it's new, it's got the headlines, and it really grips people, whereas from a probability perspective, you say, well, actually, the probability of dying from SARS actually isn't very high.
And lingering on the fringe is a pandemic, perhaps, perhaps not, another world plague, a superbug we can't beat.
Right. Well, that's of course, yeah, it's always something to sort of that's in the back to worry about. And I talk about in the book that diseases and viruses are what we call a self-replicating system. And what it means is, you know, each virus sort of, if one person's infected, then the virus tries to infect other people. But meanwhile, we're trying to stop the virus. And if on average more than one other person is infected, then that means now there's more people infected. And then if on average more, it's like the old, you know, she told two friends and they told two friends and so on. That's how things multiply. That's why viruses can spread. But if we can contain it so that on average less than one new person is infected for every person that's been infected, then we contain it. So as far as sort of a worldwide pandemic, there's always the fear. I mean, all the diseases that have come up so far that we've been worried about, including some that are very serious, I mean, including AIDS, including, you know, now avian flu and all these other things that we're worried about. So far, they've all been relatively contained, or, you know, SARS. But there is the risk that if something that spread just a little more easily than those, so we had just a little bit more in terms of how many new people get infected, then it could spread. And I think that's something that we can never completely rule out, even though I think it's quite unlikely. But of course, the consequences could be very severe. So it's something always to think about. Yeah.
Jeffrey Rosenthal, our guest, struck by lightning, the curious world of probabilities. He writes the quizzes. Sometimes he writes the quizzes for Saturday Night Magazine. We're trying to get this on the cover. What are the chances?
The cover of the magazine, right?
Yes,
not the cover of the book. Yeah.
No, no, not the on the cover of the magazine.
Absolutely. The more publicity, the better, right?
Maybe the Western editor's listening.
Yeah.
You just never know. You can't really predict it, but it's sort of just an accident. He's watching, he sees that I said, plants an idea. Does that have anything to do with what you study?
Well, yeah, I guess in a way you could make the connection. I mean, first of all, you could say, since I wrote the book, I want everyone to hear about it, so there's that connection. But as far as, let's say sort of word of mouth or rumors and how things spread, from a point of view of probability, it's quite similar to the way that diseases and viruses spread. And so, for example, just like that virus, you know, is trying to infect more people and get more people, well, if you've got a rumor or word of mouth or trying to get the publicity out, then the more people that you tell, you know, if you go home and tell 2 people to buy my book and they each go and tell 2 people and they all go and tell 2 people, well, then the whole country will buy my book, right? So, whereas if you know, nobody tells anybody else and nobody puts it on the cover of the magazine, then unfortunately I'm not going to make a lot of money off this
pretty
thing.
much you're going to have to remain a professor at the University of Toronto,
I'll have to keep my day job, that's right.
Probably. We'll come back. Jeffrey Rosenthal is visiting Studio 4. He is a statistics professor at the University of Toronto. His highly entertaining book is called Struck by Lightning, the Curious World of Probabilities. We didn't talk about the title, Struck by Lightning.
Right.
What are the chances?
Right, so lightning is interesting. First of all, on a symbolic level, it sort of symbolizes all the uncertainty out there, right? We never know where lightning is going to strike. But from the point of view of chances, so the number of people who are actually killed by lightning in Canada is extremely small. It's usually between about 3 and 8 per year. Which is actually very small compared to even these other things we've been talking about. But then on the other hand, the number of people who are seriously injured by lightning but aren't killed, that's more. That's about 3 times as many. So it's still quite small. But then I think the number of people who are struck by lightning in just sort of a minor way, and they're not that seriously injured, first of all, that's harder to say because it's not always reported. And also, so it's a little bit word of mouth. And I think it's still very unlikely, of course, but it's not quite as unlikely as we think. In other words, you know, I've never been struck by lightning, but you know, when I talk to people, they say, "Oh, well, you know, my cousin's friend was struck," and so it's not quite as unlikely as we think to be struck in some way by lightning. But to be seriously injured or to be killed by lightning in Canada is extremely unlikely. In some other countries and states, it's more likely.
Sure. Well, exactly. It depends on where you live. If you live in a state or a province where there are lightning, first of all, you have to have the storm.
Right.
And the lightning.
Yeah, places that have a lot of storms, and also another thing is that lightning, as I'm sure you know, tends to find its quickest path to the ground. So if there's tall buildings around and stuff, it'll take them. Even tall trees, it might take them. But there's nothing else around. It's all kind of nice and flat, except for you standing in the middle of an open field. Then you're likely to be the quickest path. So
chances are good.
Right. So if it's open spaces are bad for
right on the golf course, no trees, just me.
Exactly.
Chances are pretty good.
Right. If it starts,
golf clubs beside me. Yeah, I could probably get hit by lightning.
Head into the clubhouse. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And why should we care
about lightning? Well, or probability in
Probability.
general. Yeah, well,
Why is it important?
well, I mean, I think probability and uncertainty, they come up in, so many aspects of our lives. So, whether it's, well, I mentioned things like, airplane accidents and terrorists, but even more mundane things. You interview for a job and will you get it? You go to your favorite restaurant, will you have to wait for a table? You're playing poker, will you get the ace of spades just when you need it? You ask someone out on a date, will they accept the date or will they spurn you? There's all these things where we can't predict the outcome. So I would say that having a sense of probability, having a probability perspective, as I call it, even if we don't know the exact probability that they'll accept if we ask them out or that we'll have to wait for a table, so having a sense of things, just understanding that there's probabilities involved can help to put us at ease, and then having just a bit of a sense of what are the probabilities. Is this a high probability or a low probability of happening? That can go a really long way, I think, to clarifying our thinking and whether we should be afraid because our daughter's on a plane and there's a lightning storm, or whether we shouldn't. And then also, sometimes, as I discussed in the book, by balancing out sort of the good outcomes versus the bad outcomes of some action and the probabilities, you can get a sense of it. So, you ask someone out on a date, well, maybe there's only a 20% chance that they're going to say yes. So does that mean you shouldn't? Well, maybe not, because maybe if they say no, it's embarrassing, but it's not the end of the world. But if they say yes, it could be wonderful, and you could live happily ever after. So maybe it's worth it. So in other words, just thinking in terms of what are the good and bad outcomes, and what are their probabilities, we can get a sense of how to balance them and how to make better decisions.
I think it was the late Ann Landers, maybe not, one of the columnists who said, if you're 40 plus, the likelihood of you finding a husband is not good.
Yeah.
You're more likely to be shot by a sniper than get married.
Yeah, so there was actually, that goes back to a Newsweek article from, I think it's the 70s, and it was sort of, they had this cover story where they said, the chance of a 40-year-old woman ever getting married who hasn't already been married is less than the chance of her being killed by a terrorist. And actually it turned out that among many other things, that was just wrong. That was not even close to being right.
No.
And sort of came, somebody said something to somebody and they misunderstood and there was a joke and there was a this, and first thing you know, that was the cover story.
Sure.
And even though later it was retracted, and I do talk in the book about trying to figure out what really are the probabilities involved, but somehow it was completely wrong, and yet it's something that stuck with people. And around the water coolers, people say, "Oh, did you hear that?"
And we still remember it, sort of.
Right,
I mean,
sort
was
of,
it Dear Abby or Ann Landers? Who cares? If you're 40 plus, you may never get a husband.
That's right. And I think it was, first of all, it was totally wrong in its probabilities, and second of all, it sort of had some sort of negative implications. It sort of said there's something wrong with being 40 and not being married, or something like that. Whereas the reality is, first of all, the probability is not nearly that low that you won't, and also, who says 40-year-old women necessarily want to get married too? So.
And who will live long and who won't live long? That's a big area.
Yeah.
Medical research. I know one thing you don't want to be as a medical researcher. Why?
Well, I did say that, there can be ethical problems that arise, and that's why I sort of joked and said it's a good thing it's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. But so ethical problems can arise because when we do a medical study, what we usually want to do is ideally randomly assign to different people different treatments. Maybe one person gets the new drug and one person gets the old drug or something like that. And then we want to, in fact, we usually do what's called a double-blind study where even the patient and even the doctor administering the patient, they actually don't know whether you got the new drug or the old drug. And then we keep statistics of how the results were, whether the people with the new drug, more of them survived, more of them were healthy, or whether they weren't. And then we draw conclusions, and I talk in the book about how we can draw those conclusions. But on the other hand, there can be ethical things if it becomes pretty clear, or at least it seems like the new drug is better. And this was an issue with some of the AIDS treatments, that it seems like we got this new treatment, seems to be working pretty well. So then you might think, well, from some ethical point of view, maybe we should just give everyone the new treatment because it seems to be better. But from a scientific point of view, in order to have a valid study so we can see if we didn't just get lucky, but it really is a better treatment, we better keep doing this random trial.
Sure.
We better not do that. So then you've got an ethical dilemma. Do you say, forget the random trial, forget the science, we need to treat the patients right away? Or do you say, well, no, we have to wait another year or whatever it is to finish this trial and make some more definitive conclusions? So
and
that's when I said I'm glad it's not my problem.
And what if the new drug hastens your demise?
Well, exactly.
You are the test monkey after all.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, with most drugs, they first do some testing on, for example, animals and so on to try to get a sense of whether it's safe. But absolutely, when they do the first human trials, part of the issue is, they're not really sure how it's going to work on humans. And that's why, really, the drug trials are so important, and understanding the probabilities associated with them and what they do and don't prove and how they can be biased and so on is so important, too.